years ago, I met this man at a science conference. He wrote for the Wall Street Journal. He was talented, and there was a strong mutual attraction. A few weeks went by, and we met in London, where I stayed with him over a weekend. We walked the city, we hung out at small cafes and galleries, and we had this wonderful intellectual banter going. He would mention his favorite novel or some work of art, and I would challenge everything with a subtle sarcasm. I was enjoying myself and slowly began to imagine us being together in the future. Then on our last night, I asked him when he wanted to come visit me in Copenhagen. There was silence. This wonderful man just looked at his feet and said, actually, he didn't want to see me again, ever. I was just too angry a person, too aggressive. I was shocked. The whole time I'd felt I was at my most charming, when really I'd just been unbearable. I often feel I'm on a collision course with the world around me. I think, if only I weren't me, but someone else. It's as if I have my personality against me. I'd like to change it. My name is Lone Frank. I'm an author and journalist, and I have a PhD in neurobiology. I don't believe in the soul, or rather, I believe that what we call a soul is pure biology. The starting point is our genome. It plays a decisive role in how we function and what goes on in our brains. We human beings are actually complex biological machines, and I'd like to tamper with the machinery. I want to find a way to change myself through knowledge about my inner being. I've decided to take a journey. I'll visit some of the world's leading geneticists to get an understanding of my own genetic inheritance. But first, I need an overview of who I am, how my personality looks. I'll use the leading scientific tool, what psychologists call the 5-factor model. It's a test that measures aspects and dimensions of a personality. I answer 200 questions about myself on the internet, and then meet with a psychologist who gives me the lay of the land.
Personligheden, den kan man beskrive ved hjælp af 5 domæner. Og alle mennesker har de her 5 domæner. Og den første kalder vi for emotionelle reaktioner. Den går ind og måler på de negative emotioner. Hvor meget fylder de? Så der ligger du højt. Hvad siger du til det?
Jamen, det ville jeg jo godt have været klar over. Ikke? Altså, hvis der er noget, jeg sådan lægger mærke til hos mig selv, så er det der. Fokus på negative ting. Ja.
Og den næste dimension, den hedder ekstroversion. Og der kan du se, der ligger du i den lave ende. De folk, der ligger oppe i den høje ende af den skala, det er sådan nogle, der kan lide at være sammen med mennesker.
Altså jeg vil sige, jeg synes faktisk, at andre mennesker tapper mig for energi i virkeligheden.
Stemmer meget godt i overensstemmelse med, hvad
ja,
du
den er lav.
selv.
Ja, jeg bryder mig ikke specielt meget om andre mennesker.
Nej.
Altså. Nej. Slet ikke, hvis de er tæt på. Ja.
Så den næste dimension, den hedder venlighed. Og der scorer du meget lav. Der er dårligt score lavere. Ja. Den handler om, hvordan man møder andre mennesker. Man kan sådan sige, hvis folk, der scorer højt, de sådan går ligesom hen imod andre mennesker, dem, der scorer lavt, de går imod andre mennesker. Ikke? Det er sådan, og du har jo allerede givet lidt udtryk for, at det er ikke fremmed for dig, at du havner det.
Det er nok lavere end, altså jeg har nok ikke troet, at jeg lå i den absolute bund, vel?
Og jeg vil jo også gætte på, at det er sådan, at folk ikke vil opfatte dig som uvenlige, eller?
Jeg tror, nogen, de vil nok føle, at hun er ikke rar. Det kan godt være.
Og jeg har så med at kigge på det. Nu ligger det sådan her på bordet, ikke? Nu siger det er det. Det er sådan, nu er det lidt uden for dig selv.
Jamen, så ser det jo egentlig ikke særlig behageligt ud.
Det er ikke
nej. Altså, det er jo nok også det er om man så må sige, en ret negativ forventning til livet og verden. Ja. Og en ret negativ indgang. Kritisk tilgang til ting. Altså, det er vel også det, der er med til at lægge sådan, altså, fornemmelsen af altså en byrde på ens skuldre, ikke? verden er lave på en eller anden måde. Ikke? Altså, det er bare svært at leve.
Er det det?
Jamen, sådan kan jeg godt have det nogle gange, at det er jo ligesom at du ved, prøve at svømme i sirup, ikke? Altså, det er bare svært.
My father was an alcoholic, and my mother was depressed. I grew up with stories about great-grandfathers and distant uncles who killed themselves, and I've struggled with the darkness myself. But how much of this is genetic? How much of who I am today was already there from the beginning? Are our lives, for the most part, predetermined from birth because of the way we're put together? How much can we determine and change for ourselves? How are we to understand this thing, inheritance? Our DNA is actually a little alphabet with only 4 letters, A, T, G, and C. In fact, you could say that we human beings are created from information, a string of letters. They form sentences, and these sentences are our genes. I think of them as sentences in a book, a sort of inner blueprint. This book describes our possibilities, and I've read pages and whole chapters in my book. We're in the middle of a genetic revolution, and genetic tests can be easily accessed by anyone. I've sent a saliva test to Iceland, to a lab that mapped out the most important of the 25,000 genes that are found in all my cells. These days, anyone can delve into their own genetic material. The sentences in your genetic book will reveal secrets about why you look the way you do, what diseases you're likely to develop. But will they also provide hints about what goes on inside your head, who you are as a person, or who you can become? I see the world through some fairly dark glasses, so it's appropriate in a way that I'm here in a gloomy, overcast Newcastle to meet an expert on personality. Daniel NETTLE is a professor of psychology. He's interested in the mechanisms of personality and why we become who we are.
I have this 5-factor model personality test. Take a look at it. I mean, what kind of person do you see there?
Give me a second. I don't see a big people person, then, I have to say. But I see a very creative person, potentially. Which, you know... Yeah, I see someone who loses sleep sometimes. But,
I think that would be...
but does a lot of very interesting things along the way.
Yeah.
Yeah. But these things tell you what you already know, right? Because after all, it's based on what you say about yourself, so...
Yeah. I think we all sort of wonder about what is personality. It's a very fluffy thing.
Well, you know that there are some people that you just know how they're going to react. You know that, let's say you've got some friends, some of them you go up behind them, make a loud noise, they're going to jump out of their skins. And some of the others you can make a loud noise and they'll say, why did you do that? So it's like there's some really basic difference in our nervous system between some people and some other people that just determine how they'll react in a general way. Are they easily scared, or is it difficult to scare them? And this is really consistent through life. If as a kid you're easily scared, you're going to turn into an adult who's easily scared too. So I was interested in happiness, and I did a lot of research on happiness. It turns out that the biggest predictor of how happy, say, a 40-year-old is not how much they earn or how beautiful their wife is or, you know, how successful they are in their career. It's how happy they were when they were 15, right? You know, so that's amazing, right? It's shocking, actually. Terrible kind of finding. But there are these continuities in people's lives. Anxious children grow up to be anxious adults. Smiling children turn up to be happy adults. I mean, these things, they really stay with us.
Many people, if you ask them, will have the notion, and it might be an illusion, that they can change their personality.
You can change your life, right? So I would make a difference between changing your personality and changing your life. And, you know, if people are having problems with things like, you know, anxiety or sadness, there's a lot you can do about that. Mm-hmm. At some level, you'll still be a person who's prone to respond, you know, in an anxious way, but you can really change the way it affects you. You can manage it.
But what you say is that we can change our lives, the way we live our lives, but we can't really change our personality. It's pretty stable over a lifetime.
Yes.
Would you say that you're a happier individual after having studied personality for so long and understanding these things?
You know, I've spent a lot of time in my scientific career agonizing why I'm not a different kind of scientist, the kind of person who stays with the same lab experiment and does it again and again and gets it perfect. And it's like, well, that's just not what I do. There are other people who do that. And so if you can accept that your strengths are not the same strengths as someone else, rather than trying to beat yourself up and change, actually just say, this is who I am, these are my assets here. It's a really liberating thing, actually.
We are who we are.
Yeah.
But that would seem to a lot of people quite crazy.
But people keep saying that until they have their second child. And then they say, I did nothing different, and this kid is as different from the first one as a Martian is from someone who grew up on Earth, right? They're just totally different. They respond to what I do in a different way. If I behave differently towards them, it's because they're different. You've just got to conclude that the shuffling of the genetic pack is a pretty powerful business.
It made me think back, you know, how was I when I was 15? I was no joke. I was really an awful teenager. Really hard to get along with. I mean, he said, you know, yeah, you're obviously not a people person, which is true, but still, I think I've changed an awful lot since I was 15, in fact.
Nettle says that I should just accept myself the way I am and forget everything about changing. That sounds to me like old-fashioned fate. I feel that it can't be the whole story, that I just have to accept all the dark sides I'm struggling with. I want a deeper understanding of what has shaped me. It's strange, but when I think back on my childhood, it's almost never the early years I remember. Being a kindergartner, loved and pampered by parents and grandparents, playing with kids in the neighborhood, that whole warm and safe middle-class existence. No, for me, childhood crystallized around the disaster that came later, a time that I have no pictures of because no one had the desire or the energy to capture it. My father was drinking heavily, and when I was 12, my parents went through a nasty, vicious divorce. The family was split up. Not long after, my mother was diagnosed with cancer, and while I was still in high school, she died. That's what I think of as my childhood. That's what I feel must have shaped me. In London, I'm going to visit psychologist Robert PLOMIN, who has used identical twins, who are genetically the same, to investigate whether family environment influences our personality growing up. Can we say how much our parents and the way they bring us up matter to our personality as adults?
It's reasonable to think that nurture is important. I mean, you know, kids grow up with their parents, and their parents have a lot of influence over them. There's one thing I noticed in my father, where he's always been quick-tempered, you know, you say hot-blooded, you know, normally a very sane person. But when he does allow himself to get angry, he goes ballistic. And I do see that tendency in myself. So it's reasonable to think I'm just sort of modeling his way, bad way, of dealing with these difficult situations. All of psychology assume that nurture is entirely the reason why things run in families. Like me and my father's proneness to being angry, or mental illness, or cognitive abilities, or personalities. But when we started doing the genetic studies, you found a lot of influence of genetics. In about the 70s, John Lowland, whose book I have here, whose very dog-eared book because it's out of print, but this book is called Heredity, Environment, and Personality, a study of 850 pairs of twins. And it was the first time where someone put these things together to say, the genetics is so strong that it actually accounts for the familial resemblance. So things run in families for reasons of nature and nurture, but they say, but wait a minute, it looks like nature's accounting for the familial resemblance. And so he was the first one to say, as weird as this sounds, what's must be important are environmental influences that are specific to the individual and not shared by children growing up in the same family.
When I was 7.5, my brother was born. We share half our genes, and on the outside, we seem a lot alike. But on the inside, we couldn't be more different. Both our parents and everyone else always told us how incredibly different we were. I remember myself as a shy, withdrawn, and sulky kid. Well, I smile in the snapshots, but we all do. My brother, on the other hand, was an exuberant baby. One of those kids who always get people's attention. This, of course, is very counterintuitive. The old Freudian story is that our parents basically shape us. But what is the most convincing evidence that they don't have all that much influence?
Yeah, it's just as identical twins reared apart are very powerful for getting at genetic influence, because you got genetically identical people reared in uncorrelated environments. Well, the converse of that on the environmental side is adopted children who are adopted into the same home. So you have these two genetically unrelated children growing up in the same family. So to the extent that growing up in the same family makes you similar, they ought to be similar. And what you find is adoptive siblings are correlated 0. They're not at all similar. It doesn't mean the family doesn't matter. It just means that in personality, the personality of your parent doesn't affect the personality that you become environmentally. That relationship is genetic. But of course, your parents have a lot to do. They matter a lot in terms of, just how happy you are, the resources you get, say, to develop your genetic propensities.
I think it's incredibly interesting to think about that basically the only environment that doesn't seem to affect your personality, your basic psychology, is the environment that you think did everything. The environment at home, your mother and father, and so on. It's so counterintuitive, kind of impossible. But, as you said, you look at kids, you look at little kids, you can even look at, fetuses and see that they react differently and characteristically to, stimuli, circumstances. So, yeah, we do have a personality, and it's kind of laid down very early.
If genes shape us more than our parents do, as PLOMIN says, I need to know more about them, know what they actually do. I call for an appointment at Duke University in North Carolina, where there's an expert whose research is shifting the boundaries of our understanding. On my trip across the Atlantic, I read up on things, dive into the first studies that showed how genes and environment work together. It makes for interesting reading. We know of a handful of genes that work in the brain and fundamentally influence our psyche and personality. 2 of these genes are called MAOA and SCRT. They're both found in 2 different variants that affect the chemistry of the brain differently, a robust variant and a sensitive variant. The psychologists Terry Muffet and Avshalom Caspi were studying these variants 10 years ago when they made a major scientific breakthrough. Caspi and Muffet gene tested more than 1,000 people and discovered that the combination of gene variants and childhood environment was crucial for their behavior as adults. A sensitive variant of the MAOA gene and a traumatic childhood resulted in higher risk for aggressive behavior, even criminality. A sensitive variant of the SCRT gene and childhood trauma, on the other hand, resulted in a higher risk of depression. So the message was, it's not genes alone or childhood traumas alone that determine our development. It's about how our personal cocktail of genes and environment is shaken. My own little gene experiment has given me an unpleasant surprise. It turns out that I only have risk variants, no robustness at all. It feels a little like losing in the great genetic lottery. Should I see myself as a terrible train wreck? As someone who needs pampering, who should be packed in cotton? I need to understand the connection between what these genes do in my brain and how it affects the way I experience the world. In his research, AHMAD HARIRI has studied how you get from pure genetic knowledge to a sense of life as it's actually lived.
The central theme of our research is to understand individual differences, meaning why is it that when two people encounter the same thing in their lives, they respond to it very differently from each other? And more specifically, what is it about our biology that makes us respond differently, that creates the individual differences that we all see in each other? Two siblings, a brother and a sister, can respond very differently to the death of a parent. One can be resilient and to plan the funeral and to help all the other family grieve and mourn, while the other just simply unravels, falls apart. Why is that? It's the same experience, the death of a mom or dad, but a completely different, almost polar opposite response. And this is of two individuals who are largely genetically related, but they're not genetically identical. And those genetic differences can influence the way the brains are working or processing this information, and in turn, whether one is resilient, as we say, to stress, or vulnerable, susceptible to stress.
I remember when our mother died, I broke down completely, and for a long time I couldn't function. But it seemed like my brother took it in stride. I don't know whether it was because he was so much younger or because he's just more robust. But I do know that even today, he's one of those people who can handle any form of stress, completely the opposite of me.
So there's a structure in the brain called the amygdala. It exists in every animal with a backbone and really does, for the most part, the same thing in all of those animals, whether it's a lizard, a bird, a monkey, or a man. One of the core jobs of the amygdala is to process threat, to let us know when something out in our environment could harm us. We need stress. It's absolutely critical to the survival of every species. Without stress, we would have died off eons ago, right? Because nothing phases us, nothing mobilizes us. We just kind of walk around blindly, and then boom, you know, the lion gets us at the watering hole. You don't want that. But it has to be regulated. You need to have a stress response, and once you've dealt with that stressor, you need to be able to quiet it down. You need to be able to down-regulate or inhibit that stress response.
And that's another region of the brain that does that?
Exactly, yeah. So the amygdala doesn't really care so much about what happens afterward. It's, I like to say, like a watchdog. So when we're at home in our beds at night sleeping, and our dog starts to bark violently, loudly, the amygdala is sensing something, like the dog. There's something outside of the house, I don't like it. It's different, it's strange, and I am going to let you know, I'm gonna let my owner know that I'm not happy. So the owner in our brain is the prefrontal cortex. It's the seat of our, rather unique human abilities to create, to predict, to identify patterns in our world, and to, in this context, very carefully control our behaviors.
So it's an executive director?
Exactly. The dog is barking, it's good, I'm up, I'm out of bed, now I'm gonna go and figure out what's wrong. And I get to my dog and I look out the window and I notice, oh, it's just a group of kids passing by being loud. Now, it's my job as the owner, as the responsible party, to tell my dog, it's okay, let's go back to bed. If I don't do that, the dog is just gonna continue barking and continue barking and continue barking and continue barking. This is essentially what we find to be the problem in the brain when we have an anxiety disorder. or even to a certain extent with depression. When we think about a depressed person, we think about someone who's kind of closed off from the world and has retreated to a more inward focus. Well, that's in many ways the consequence of having been overreactive, having been bombarded by stimulation and by an excessive amygdala response in the absence of proper prefrontal control, and then shutting down.
Talk about a big dog. I can easily imagine my own amygdala as a growling German shepherd snapping at my heels. Stress is like a cloud, always hanging over my head that I can't get away from. It's like everyone else can relax and enjoy life, while I am like a tightly wound coil. So you're telling me that genes have a direct influence on how tense my personality is?
Yes. At one level, we have genetics that help us understand how big and how loud that dog is. There are also genes that influence how capable the prefrontal cortex is of regulating the amygdala. Are you a good owner or are you a bad owner? One of those variants is in a gene called COMT. And COMT contributes to dopamine signaling, and very uniquely in the prefrontal cortex. And there are, again, two common versions. We call one the VAL and the other the MET. All right? And what that means for us practically is that when a person with a MET allele background, let's say you're a MET-MET.
I am, in fact.
You're a MET-MET. So you have relatively more dopamine in your prefrontal cortex, which means when you're asked to do something, you're very precise and very focused. You're able to lock into that and just get the job done. The problem is in something we call perseveration, meaning that even though you've quieted the dog and the people have passed by the house, everything is quiet and safe, when you go back to bed, you're going to think about that over and over again.
Rumination.
You're going to ruminate. You're going to perseverate. You're
Yes.
going to think about, oh, man, the dog barked. It was so scary. And what were those people doing out there? Next thing you know, it's 8 o'clock and you're still thinking about it. You're up all night.
That's
right?
like hearing about myself.
Yeah,
Right here.
so that's you can imagine that that's a very, very dangerous type of thinking. And rumination and perseveration are core symptoms of depression.
I know we humans are just biological machinery, but still it's a very strange sensation to be able to relate this abstract knowledge to something that can be felt deep within the body. The chemical mechanisms Hariri's talking about fit perfectly with my own experience of the world, how I see it, how I feel it, and live it. I'm all too familiar with rumination. All it takes is a chance remark from a friend to set it off, to get me to wake up at 4 in the morning, obsessively thinking, what did he mean by that? I'm the sort of person who worries about everything. Am I doing okay at my job? Is it even the right job for me? Will I ever amount to anything? It actually corresponds to something they've discovered about the COMT gene. Scientists speak of people like me who carry 2 copies of the MET variant as worrious, as opposed to people with 2 copies of the VAL variant, who they call warriors. Warriors act and react, while we worriers think, we ruminate.
Knowing about these genetic effects, is there anything I can do about that? For example, I have all these so-called risk alleles, and I also have, personality problems with high neuroticism and very, very low agreeableness.
As surprised as people often are when they ask me, okay, well, what do we do with this? I think most people expect me to say, well, we're going to develop a drug for this and a drug for that. The reality is we have the tools behaviorally to modify the brain, to retrain the brain, and we can actually apply different behavioral strategies based on genetic background, right? This is the idea that through systematic retraining, you can quiet down the watchdog. So that's one thing you can do. The other is a more top-down approach, which is retraining the prefrontal cortex to be more flexible. And that's a more conscious decision to focus on the good.
But as a short, and met,
Right.
what would you do?
I would probably do a combination. In effect, what we're suggesting is you need to, you know what's a good way to work with this? Have a stiff drink at the end of the day.
I do have 2 glasses of red wine every day.
Yeah.
I do it for my heart, haha.
Right, yeah.
But
Yes,
now I can say I do it for my
right.
prefrontal cortex.
Yes, yeah. You want, it's gonna sound a little strange, but someone like you needs to check out.
Yeah.
Right? Is just to stop thinking. And one of the best ways to reduce the efficiency of the prefrontal cortex is through alcohol.
Great.
Right?
Great.
So do your attentional modification and then continue to have the 2 glasses of wine every day and you should be fine.
My meeting with Hariri is the high point of the journey so far. He tells me that there is something I can do. When we know about our genes, it says something about our brains and the brain we can shape. It's plastic and can be changed. So maybe there are possibilities, even for someone with my sensitive equipment. But what if you've taken a really hard hit, biologically speaking? What sort of person do you get with the worst possible combination of genes and brain activity? From North Carolina, I've driven to Albany, New York, to meet a man who's spent years looking at the brain scans of criminals. We're not talking about pickpockets here, but people who've committed the most horrific crimes. James Fallon studies the inner workings of mass murderers.
What I noticed after going through about 20 of these, they may have had like damage to different parts of the brain, but they all had an underlying pattern where they had very low activity in the base of their frontal lobe, and also in the amygdala, in the temporal lobes. It was that area, the areas of the brain that control pleasure and violence, etc. The id, you know, it's the amygdala, was down, but also the area that is has to do with control of behavior, inhibiting behavior, but also codes for ethics and morality. That was also turned off. These people that I was looking for, the area of the brain that says, I think this may be wrong, or I shouldn't do that, was turned off. I was sitting in my office, and I had this pile of scans. A lot of murderers. Some were impulsive murderers, some were psychopathic murderers, and some were normals. And I got a knock at the door, and in comes Dave, our main technician. He says, I've got your family scans. And, okay. So I said, just put them here. Couldn't do a full analysis. Well, I just went through, and I have done this long enough, I could quickly see if there's something wrong, if there's an aberrant pattern. And I said, that's very normal, and I went to the second one. The third one, looked at it, you know, looked very good. The fourth one, and I got to the bottom of the pile, and the last one there, I looked at, and it just jumped right out at me because I said, this is, well, that's a psychopathic murderers, or at least a psychopath. You can't tell by the scan if somebody's a murderer, but you know they have the traits. And I said, this must be in the wrong pile because it looked like all these other scans of these murderers I had in the other pile. And so I called Dave back. I said, you got to help me here. I said, this is, you know, you've misplaced the pile. So I had him go back and check. I said, just check this. And he came back and he goes, no, it's one of your family members. And I said, okay, we got to find out who this is. So he peeled off the code, and there was James H. Fallon. It was me. And of course, you know, I immediately started laughing. It really threw me for a loop, but it didn't bother me because I knew that I hadn't killed anybody or raped anybody or done anything really bad. I was just a regular little bad boy, but that's it, like anybody.
But didn't it make you question, like, why with the same brain pattern as all these murderers, am I not a murderer, but a fairly good guy?
Well, yeah, this set up several years of a hunt.
Fallon and I are chasing the same thing. We want a molecular understanding of ourselves. But not only do we have a common fascination, he's also incredibly good company. He's fun, he embraces everyone around him, and even a snail like me is drawn out of my shell. I'm invited to a barbecue with Fallon's 3 brothers in Saratoga Springs. I'm sitting here surrounded by a family with warm relations, and I'm reminded that I almost have none. I think about how strange this biological connection is. The brothers are very different, but they all still have some very deep features in common. Their great energy, extrovertedness, and a need to feel life.
We have barbecues, we have family parties, and my mother loves these because she always had these kind of parties, you know, here at this house. So I could tell by the twinkle in her eye that she had something. She said, have you seen this book about your father's family? This was a historical book, and it was called Killed Strangely. And Killed Strangely is the story about the Cornell family. Now, my grandfather was Harry Cornell Fallon. A cousin that lives in the back here, his name is Cornell. We're Cornells on this whole side. It's a British family. I went in and skimmed through it. In that, the first case of matricide, the killing of a mother by a son, is my direct grandfather. Goes all the way back to like 1675. But then, at the end of the book, there was a whole string of these other murders, all in that same line. Really murders above and beyond the cultural norm at the time. So we've got all these sort of murders, and it's now 4 lines of our family on that side. So I started to look around at some genetic combinations that would do that. What would turn off these areas? And in looking at it, one was a serotonin receptor, a certain group of serotonin receptors, and they turn on and off these areas. I knew from the Dutch study, Brunner's study in 1992, where there was all these men in the family had this gene that coded for MAOA. They were all like criminals and very violent.
So that was why MAOA was originally called the aggression gene.
Yeah, aggression or warrior gene.
Yeah.
Of course, Caspi in 2002 saw that it wasn't just the gene, but how it interacts with early abuse. And it had to be significant abuse. You know, putting those together, it was like, okay, there's a set of genes that naturally turns off those areas during development. It changes, if you have those genes, it changes the size of those areas, the amygdala, especially in boys.
Fallon is convinced that the safety of his childhood home and a mother who understood him kept him from going over to the dark side. In a way, it makes sense, because genes and environment are forever locked in a very special dance with each other. Think of our genetic book. It has to do with how it's interpreted. Some sentences or paragraphs will be read, others skipped, which is to say that only some genes are active. So the way you live your life becomes crucial for which genes are turned on and off in your cells.
My sense of empathy is equal to everybody. So I don't have a different empathy for people close to me. But if I see a child in pain, that upsets me. But I don't get any more upset with somebody close to me.
Right.
I live on emotional flatland, but it's a high enough flatland that I feel conscious that I have to do good works, which I always have.
Yeah.
And I'll do things for people, but I'll do them for strangers as much as I will for my own sister. And so my genes have produced kind of a frontal lobotomy in one spot. The upper part of my brain, the thinking part, it works better than, because it's not bothered by the functioning of this orbital cortex. And it puts me at a great advantage because I can still do all the higher functioning things, and I'm not slowed down by tragedy.
Fallon has been diagnosed as a prosocial psychopath, so a friendly psychopath, and he's apparently fine with that. It seems as if he's accepted his biology, both the advantages and the disadvantages. I think about whether I could reach some sort of acceptance, become reconciled to the baggage I'm schlepping around.
It's so funny because I sitting here, I feel almost like talking to my father. He died a few years ago, and he had, people would say he had psychopathic traits. I would say he was the person I loved most in the world. He was great. I mean, he brought me up, basically. He was my sort of base in life. He thought I was the greatest. But he also had that sort of, yeah, things didn't bother him. And he was really sort of, he thought it was so bad for me that I would, why are you bothered by all these things? They don't matter. But it's like, it's something you can't turn off.
Right.
But and I'm like, there must be a way to turn this stuff off. So I sort of set out on this genetic journey to learn information that could help me change myself. If you were me, I mean, what would you do with this kind of information?
Think of where you're sitting here. You got here partially because of that pain.
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah.
What drives you? What's making you do what you do? And it's funny, we look at artists. There's so many artists, creative people with depression, usually bipolar.
Yeah.
They go down to that terrible groundwater nobody else wants to go to, way down.
Yeah.
They don't produce anything, but when they come back up, they bring,
Then you can do
they
something
bring
with it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
They come up with this wonderful thing. And that's, to me, it's a gift.
Yeah.
Fallon says I have to think about my life in a different way, that what I think of as a weakness can also be a strength. But that's easy for him to say. The man is a friendly psychopath. He hasn't been dealt a sensitive, fragile hand in the genetic game. I experience all my risk factors as an obstacle, something I have to overcome. But I've heard about a scientist who has a new way of looking at genetic sensitivity. His name is BELSKY. He's an American psychologist, and I find out that he's going to a conference in Zurich. On my way home, I make one last stop.
I think one of the problems with child development and the study of human development is that we've been excessively influenced by the Enlightenment, and we become romantic idealists who believe that humans are perfectible organisms. That if we just loved them, cared for them, nurtured them, stimulated, we'd have peace on Earth. Well, if you're an evolutionary biologist, you know that that's nonsense. So an evolutionary biological perspective taught me, don't romanticize development. Understand that organisms have a primary goal in life, like all living things, which is to reproduce and pass on their genes. As a developmental psychologist who studies children and families, my interests are how do experiences shape who we are. And the notion is that early experiences shape who we are, whether that's the first 5 seconds of life, the first 5 months, or the first 5 years. And I came to realize that, wait a minute, the future is inherently uncertain. So therefore, why would nature craft an organism whose tomorrow is dictated by how the winds are blowing today? Because if the winds changed, then they're all going over the waterfall. It's a dead end. And that said to me that theoretically, what we should have is variation in susceptibility to environmental influences. Now, my presumption was that that would be more or less inborn. My close friends are Professors Avshalom Caspi and Temi Moffat. And before their now classic paper on gene-environment interaction came out, I saw the figure. And that figure, that graph they had, showed that with a certain genotype, if you were maltreated, you were more likely to be antisocial. Well, what I noticed right away was, hey, there's a part of this figure that shows that those same supposedly vulnerable people who carry a certain genotype, so that they'll be more aggressive and antisocial when they grow up if they're maltreated, that if they weren't maltreated, they were the least aggressive. What became clear is that under bad conditions, just as those risk theories predicted, those kids with those genotypes look like they did badly.
Yeah.
But if in the few studies that actually had measures of positive environment, or sometimes it was just the absence of a bad environment, you weren't maltreated. Not that your parents were really nice, you just weren't maltreated.
Just a normal childhood.
That those same kids with those same genes we're doing much better than other kids. Babies can have difficult temperaments. They're highly negatively emotional. They're hard to settle. I had one of these. I came away from the experience wondering why there wasn't more child abuse, because I wanted to wring this kid's neck so often.
This was your own kid?
This is my oldest son, Daniel. And I always used to say about Daniel, it's a good thing we got him.
What?
Because we could cope with him. Where it was very easy to see how a family, if you were depressed, if you lacked resources, if you didn't have understanding, if you were overwhelmed by life, this kid would have, you might have thrown him against the wall.
Right.
You might have called him names, you might have hit him, okay? But what those parents who have those kids are never told is, this kid's gonna try your patience, but you know what? You've got a diamond in the rough here. This kid, you can really make an imprint on. You can really develop him because he or she has great upside opportunity as well as downside risk. And that really is, or can be, a blessing, not, if you would, a curse. We have another concept, not only risk, but resilience.
Right.
That you and I both grew up in divorced homes.
Right.
I become a basket case because I have risk characteristics, my genes, my physiology, whatever.
Yeah.
You,
I triumph.
no, you don't triumph. You just sort of, it's water off a duck's back. It doesn't matter.
Right.
You're who you're going to be almost no matter what.
Yeah. Robustness.
Right. So it looks like I'm vulnerable, and you're what we would call resilient. You did not succumb. But now, let's put us in another thought experiment where we're poor kids, but the world changes and we get moved into a program or an environment where things are really flush and rich and there's lots of opportunity. All of a sudden, the risky guy over here flourishes. The resilient person over there stays who she was. So resilience isn't an unmitigated good. It's an unmitigated good when things go badly. But when things go well, you may not be able to benefit.
Yeah.
And that's nature's way of hedging its bets, that if things go badly, people like you are going to do better than people like me. But if things go well, people like me are going to do better than people like you.
To me, that is such an interesting and positive way of thinking about genetics, because it is sort of leaving the medical model of diseased and well, or normal and sick. And it's all about biological variation. And there is a good evolutionary reason for biological variation. It tells us there is no perfect genome.
Absolutely.
In fact, there is no perfect brain physiology.
Absolutely.
It depends on what context you're in.
Absolutely.
I mean, this brings me to myself. I have had, genetic tests. And I was basically told that I have, 2 copies of the risk allele for everything. MAO-A, serotonin transporter, COMT, BDNF.
So you should be depressed, antisocial, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. I might have turned out a lot worse if I, didn't grow up in a certain environment, for example. The thing is, it gets me thinking about what is it about my upbringing, my childhood, that would have been positive? Because when I think about, early childhood, there was a horrible divorce between my parents who hated each other from I was, 10 years old, and they couldn't speak to each other ever again. My mother died when I was 18, and my father was an alcoholic. But then again, I had an extremely close relationship with my father. I mean, I really, really loved him.
Nobody's life is perfectly wonderful. Each one of us who've had, if you would, a good life, they weren't perfect lives. They were difficulties. So in that sense, I think one has to look at a totality of exposures.
Every single morning from when I was 3 to when I was 6, I sat on the back of the bike as my father took me to kindergarten. It was a glorious 20 minutes when we talked about anything and everything. Sometimes we had a quick round of blind chess. It was a time when the world opened up. There is no perfect life, and no perfect genetic material either. Our genes are not just good or just bad. We all fill a place in the great evolutionary game, and nature has use for all our variations. My genetic journey has been like lifting the lid and looking into my own internal machinery. The information in the genes is fixed, but it's only a starting point. Environment and genes can never be seen as isolated from each other. They're engaged in an eternal exchange. It can be said that genes and environment meet in our brains. The brain is plastic and malleable. I've achieved an insight into the physical peculiarities of my brain and have a feeling I can learn to rein in my amygdala and tone down my frontal cortex. That I can regulate my propensity to ruminate by simply thinking differently. Maybe personality cannot be changed radically, but it's all about seeing possibilities and not just limitations. Understanding yourself in a different way and changing your perspective can make all the difference. What looked to me like a disastrous childhood, a blemished personality, and a fragile genetic makeup now stands in a different light. I'll undoubtedly run into problems in the future, men who don't understand me, sleepless nights, but I feel I know myself better now, at a biological level, and that makes me better equipped. The genetic revolution has only just begun, and scientists are merely scratching the surface with their theories and investigations. But what today looks like impossibly complicated information will soon become a completely natural part of our lives. What will this mean for how we look at ourselves? What will it mean for being human?